So the next feature I'd like to build in our blog before we finish this project is I'd like to add the ability to write draft blog posts. So if I have an idea, I can write it, I can save it, and we don't have to publish it right away to the public internet. So our blog can be kind of a place for us to work on ideas before we even finish them. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there's a lot of different ways that we can handle this. And I'm going to make a couple notes in our model for our blog post to kind of explain what we could do. The first is we could use a status string field, and the status could be something like draft or published. And we could use this in order to keep track of the status of the blog post. We could just change it from one to the other to mark it as published, and we could update our views to only include those published blog posts. So we could ignore all the draft ones, but as the user who's doing the work in the back end, I could go and look at all of the blog posts. So that is one option. It's really straightforward and works really well, but it has some limitations. For example, what if I want to publish a blog post next week or next month? What if I've written something and I have a schedule and I want to be able to post this in the next few days or next month or something? This gives us no way to actually schedule that to be published in the future. So there's a few different other options that we could do for that. But the main one that I want to show is, what if we have a published at date time field on our model? So I'm going to actually rename these to lowercase like we would see in our database. So we would have something like published and published at like that. And what this could be is it could be null. In our database, it would be considered null. In Ruby, it'd be considered nil. So it could be not published, which means draft state. And we could also have a time that is like 1 year ago. This is the Rails syntax for creating a date a year from the current time in the past. And then we could have 1 year from now. And so this could be a date in the future 1 year from the current time. And what's cool about this is it kind of does the same thing as the status field, because we still have the draft state and we have the published state. Anything in the past would be published. But we also end up with an extra feature that we can get out of this, where we can say, hey, anything in the future, let's ignore those. Those are scheduled posts. So we could have a scheduled status on our blog post, but this doesn't give us an exact time to publish it. So if a user comes to the website a year from now, if that blog post is still marked scheduled, we can't show it because we don't know when it's scheduled for. So using a published at timestamp helps us kind of accomplish those same things, but actually gives us the specific time when the blog post should be visible to a user. So that's pretty cool. That basically is a way for us to accomplish the same thing as we would with a status, but with some more details, like the exact time. So then the next time a person refreshes the page and the time goes from a year or just short of a year to a year from now, then that refresh of the page would say, oh, this new post is a year from now, so we will display that once it's ready to go. So this is what we're going to go with. We're going to add the published at date time field to our app, and we can use that to add some checks and stuff in our controller to make sure we don't display any draft or scheduled posts. So let's take a look at how we would go about doing that. We're going to go to our terminal. We're going to run Rails generate migration. We're going to call it add published at to blog posts. And this is going to require us to have the published at field as a date time column. Now, by naming our migration to blog posts at the end, Rails will analyze that name, and it will automatically know that this published at should go to the blog post table. So when we run this, it's going to generate a migration file that we see right here. And if we look at that migration that it generated under db migrate, this new green file, it's figured out that we want to add it to the blog post table. So we want to add a column to the blog post table named published at, and it's a date time column. And so it was able to read this migration name that we gave it and interpret that as the blog post table. So that's pretty awesome. So we're going to run Rails DB migrate in order to add this to our database locally in development. When we deploy this, it will automatically be running the migrations on the deploy to production. So we'll have that. And then our blog post, we need a way to be able to grab only the draft blog posts, only the scheduled blog posts, and also the published blog posts. So we're going to write a scope, as it's called, for those. So in order to separate those out, what we can say is, I'm going to do this here at the bottom. We will say scope, draft. And when we normally say blog post.all, this queries all of the records in the database. By adding a scope, it allows us to call post.draft to grab all the draft blog posts. And so we give this a lambda in Ruby, and we tell it to run a where query, and we say where the published at field in the database is nil. So we're only looking for blog posts where the published at is nil. Then we can do the same thing for our published and our scheduled blog posts, and these are going to be slightly different. Instead of doing a hash as we pass it in, what we want is we want these to be where the time is less than or equal to time.zone or time.current, we can say, which is the current time and in the proper time zone. So the published blog posts are going to be anything where the published at time was in the past, and then our scheduled is going to end up with the same thing where we say published at, but we want it to be greater than the current time. So we're using a Ruby Lambda here to evaluate this, because if we were to execute this when our Rails app booted, it would actually store the current time and always use that time when Rails booted. So the Lambda allows us to evaluate this every time we make a query for blog post.scheduled or .published. So that's going to evaluate the current time whenever we want to query the database, which will be accurate instead of storing that old time that we accidentally cached. So the lambdas help with that so that this gets evaluated every time we ask for it. So this is great, which means that we can get rid of these notes that we wrote in here, and we can go to our controller, blog post controller. Instead of blog post.all, we can say we want the published blog posts. And when we go to the show action, we want to grab the published blog post only. So we can add published.find. Now, this is one of those situations where if we change it here, this is also going to change it for all of these that set the blog post, which is going to be the edit, update, and destroy actions. But unfortunately, that would mean that if we only look up the published blog posts, that would mean that you could not edit or delete or update a draft blog post or a scheduled blog post. So what we want to do is we want to take this and we want to put this in the show action, because this should only, the blog post homepage and the show action should only ever show those blog posts that are in a published state, unless we want to do something a little bit different where we can check and see if the user is logged in. So we could do that as one option, but we could also say if user is signed in, we could find any blog posts, but if the user's not signed in, we only want them to see published blog posts. So we can do this logic here in order to set that accordingly. And we can refactor this into a little bit shorter of a line by doing a ternary. And we can say, if the user is signed in, any blog post, or we can look up only published blog posts and find those. So that is going to be a little ternary if statement in line that will set our blog posts. So we can try this out now by adding the published at field into our form and then allowing that to be saved. So in order to allow that published at field to be saved, we have to add published at to our blog post params. So when our form sends that over, it doesn't ignore it, because if it was not in this array in the permitted parameters, you could send it over with the form and it would actually remove it. So actually, let's just go try that out so you can see it. If we go to our form for blog posts, we can add a section down here, div form.label published at, and we can use a Rails helper called form.date time select published at. I believe that's the name for it. We'll find out in a second. Need to run our migrations. Rails will always remind us of that. And yes, it's not date time select. Rails date time select. Aha, it is date time select as one word. That's what it is. There we go. So you can always Google for things like that if you were not sure. But this is going to give us a select box for the year, the month, the date, the hour, the minute. And the other thing that we want to look at here is actually, if we go to the Rails API docs, under date time select, I would like to be able to have a empty field for these. So right now, you see it's setting the current time, but I would like to be able to set it to empty so that we could have a draft post. So under date time select, there was no information about including a blank version. But if we go to date select and we look at the top here, we also can find some documentation for everything. And include blank is what we can set to true if you would like to be able to set an empty date. So if we go to our code and we add comma include blank as true, what we'll get is a form field that now you can select, an empty date and time for this. So this will be considered a draft blog post. And we can also go into our model if we ever wanted to add some helper methods, or we could ask a blog post, are you in draft mode? We could say def draft ? And we could say published at is nil. And that would return true or false if the blog post has no published at date. So that works. And then we could do ones for published as well. And we would say, if there is a published at value, Rails will give you this method with the ? So we can access the column and check to see if there is any value inside of that. If it's blank, then this would return false. But if there is a time set on our published at column, it would return true. So we can make sure that there is a value set and that published at is less than or equal to time.current, just like we do in our SQL query up above. This would just be evaluating the Ruby version that we have in memory and we're working with. Maybe we don't allow you to comment on draft blog posts or scheduled blog posts. So if we build comments features in the future, we could say you can only comment on a published blog post or something, and we could use these helper methods to check that. So then we can also do one for schedule just to be complete. Same thing here, published at ? And published at is greater than time.current. And that would represent a scheduled post where the time is in the future. Perfect. So now we can go into our Rails logs and actually look and see we submitted that forum post with the published at column in it, but here we get this red message that says unpermitted parameters published at, and basically it's telling us we submitted the published at, but it's not in the params list of permitted parameters, so it's going to ignore it. And in development, it's going to sometimes raise an error or just print out this message for you, and then in production, it will just get rid of it and ignore it. So in order for us to actually save a value here, we have to say that published at column is a permitted parameter inside of this. So params require and then permit all of the fields that you want to allow. So now if we go to edit and we say 2023, March 29th, and we say midnight, we can edit that, and our logs are going to say, okay, great. We will update the published at to the value that you submitted in the form, and no red error message saying that it was an unpermitted parameter. So then if we go to our homepage, we can go and look at this blog post, and we'll see that it is published. If we were to go and edit that blog post and make it something that was draft mode, we can go all the way up to the top on each one of these, mark it as blank, and then if we go to our homepage, what we want to see is that that blog post is no longer visible because it is in draft state, which is perfect. So another thing we could do is we could say up here on the index page, if the user is signed in, we could display blog post.all. And if they're not signed in, we could display the published ones. So what we might want to do, if we want to display these blog posts when I'm logged in as the administrator, everybody else should only see the published blog posts, but me as the administrator, I want to be able to see these blog posts so I can edit my draft ones or my scheduled ones. So what we can do is we can go into our view for the index, and next to these, we could say if the blog post is in draft mode, then we could say the word draft and maybe a little div here. We could say class, BG gray 100, text gray 900, draft, div, and then maybe we do a little padding and rounding. So if we did like P2 and rounded, this would allow us to put a little badge there next to it so that we would see that, oh, this blog post is in draft mode. And of course, there is a little bit of CSS from Tailwind CSS Pros where the H1 is putting a lot of space up above. So maybe we want this to be in between that and the body or something like that. So we can, play with our CSS, but this draft mode is only going to be visible for us as the user who is managing the blog. So if we go to Hello World and we publish this one in the past, so we could do any date that we want that is in the past, update our blog post. If we go to the homepage again, we will see that this is now published. And if we pull up our incognito window where we are not logged in, we're a guest, and that blog post is now visible. So let's go create a scheduled blog post. Scheduled post, scheduled. This one will be in the future in 2028, January 1st at midnight. We'll create that blog post, and going to our homepage, we will see that scheduled post, and it would be good for us to do a similar thing to this. We would say else if this is scheduled, we can say scheduled, and maybe this one, instead of being gray, we will say it's blue, because the scheduled posts are going to be visible in the future. And if we refresh our incognito window, we will have a blog post that's only the published one, same as before, because the draft and the scheduled are filtered out for us. Now, another thing that would be handy to have is that our scheduled post might be first, and our draft post might be last, and our published might go in between. We could kind of use that published at state for sorting. So if we went to our blog post model, we could say scope, sorted, and we can order on the published at column and say descending. So we get the newest version first, and we could sort automatically. So here we could say, instead of all of the posts, we can say sorted. And for our published blog posts as well, we could sort those too. So when we come to our homepage, we get the scheduled first, the older posts, Basically, the newest post first, which will always be scheduled because they're in the future, then the latest post, then the next latest post, and so on until we get to the draft ones. And then those will also be sorted just kind of randomly because they're all empty values for the published at state. You could also go and add an additional column to sort by and say maybe you want to do by ID or you want created at or updated at, maybe. That could be another one. You could say updated at and sort by that as your secondary column. So the first one that we would sort by is published. And then if multiple ones have the same published timestamp, which would be only for our draft ones, which they would all be nil, then it would sort by the updated at in descending order. So that would be another option you could use. It would preserve all of this unless you have 2 draft posts. So we'll say another draft post. And if we go back to our homepage, you will see now the new drafts post is first. But if we were to edit this one and just update that, going back to our homepage, we'll show that, or as long as that got updated in our database, which actually didn't change anything, so it didn't even touch that. So we'd have to go modify that post. Let's actually do that. ASDF2, there we go. That will have updated the updated at timestamp, and now that is the top one in our draft section here at the bottom. So there's a lot of cool stuff that we can do with this based upon whether the user signed in or not. We can query our database table and use scopes to combine these different things that we might want to filter by or to sort by. And then we can give these Ruby helpers a way to look at the database columns, and then our views can be modified to say, let's only display that little badge when there's a scheduled post or a draft post and so on, which is pretty cool. But before we go and finish this lesson, let's go and add this code to our Git repository. So first we want to make sure we add the db migrate file that we added for our migration. And then we can do our usual git add-p to walk through all of the changes and make sure we want to include each of those. So here we're going to say yes to this one because we want to make sure that if we're signed in, we can see all the blog posts. Otherwise, we only want to see the published ones. So we'll say yes, and then we can say, okay, for setting the blog post and the published at column, we want both of those changes as well. So we'll say yes, and then we can include our scopes and our methods on the blog post to check if a blog post is draft, published, or scheduled. And actually, before we do that, let's actually remove not include this and quit because I noticed a typo. So you might have noticed this earlier. Scheduled should be a question mark. And this is a good little bug that we could have run into in and our view actually was fine because we used the same typo there. But this is one of those cases where you want to read each line and make sure that you didn't make any mistakes like that. So let's actually add this to Git, and then in the next video, let's go add a test for that to make sure that the draft, published, and scheduled methods all work the way we want them to. So now that we've added that, let's go back through and add git add-p and make sure that our changes look correct. And they do, so we'll add all of that, run git status again, and then we can git commit and say add published at for draft, published, and scheduled blog posts. Then we can git push that up to our GitHub repository, and then we are all ready to write a couple tests and then deploy this to production.